There was sterilization protection for 100 surgical trays used 365 times over a 10-year period. And that's the way they extrapolated it. And basically, the conclusions of that, without going into 15 pages, the conclusion of that was that if you used a rigid container system, that you only had half of the green light gas emissions than if you had wrap.
Rising above the buzz of ultrasonic cleaners and the clanking of stainless steel are the ideas and voices that are changing an industry. You're listening to the Beyond Clean podcast, the central nexus for the people, processes, and products that are improving our sterile processing world. Each week we speak with frontline technicians, CEOs, engineers, and entrepreneurs with a common goal to help you fight dirty. Every instrument, every time. Whether you're tuning in for education or inspiration, we're glad you did. Now turn on those washers and turn up the volume. It's time to go Beyond Clean.
On this Vendor Spotlight, we speak with Barbara Ann Harmer, Vice President of Clinical Services at Innovative Sterilization Technologies, One Tray, and also David Jagrosse, President at David Jagrosse Consulting. Barbara is a highly skilled, knowledgeable, and visionary perioperative nursing leader with over 44 years of administrative and clinical management and internal and external consulting experience in both inpatient, outpatient, and multi-campus healthcare facilities. She is the founder and president of Medisys Consultants Incorporated, a highly respected and experienced consulting company for over 34 years. She has successfully provided medical and surgical consulting services to over 300 clients nationally and internationally. Barbara Ann's record demonstrates increasingly challenging healthcare leadership positions, and she is sought after as a speaker for local, regional, and national symposiums and conventions. And David Jagrosse, over 30 years of experience in CSSD, SPD as a technician, supervisor, and manager. He delivers educational presentations, has published articles, and offers consultant services and AMI-based assessments to CSS, OR, endoscopy professionals throughout the world. He provides medical device reprocessing subject matter expertise to medical device manufacturers, medical companies, independent practices and surgical centers, and off-site sterile processing centers. He is an active member of ISHM, served 2 terms on the executive board, and is a past president of ISHM and ISHM chair technical advisor. So this is going to be a very interesting discussion today because as we've learned over, I'd say more than the last year, is that the demand for supplies, and specifically for today's conversation, personal protective equipment or PPE, has gone up exponentially, and it has led to a shortage in supply. And I can tell you, having worked with supply chain professionals across the country, that's been their number one concern or number one job since the pandemic hit. And even prior to that, due to some recalls, is just sourcing and providing the supplies that are needed to continue delivering healthcare. So we're going to talk about that with Barbara Ann Harmer and David Jagrosse, the PPE shortage and some approaches to managing this both in the short term and the long term after a short break.
You're listening to Beyond Clean, the global voice of sterile processing.
Joining us now is Barbara Ann Harmer, Vice President of Clinical Services at IST One Tray, and Dave Jagrosse, President at David Jagrosse Consulting. I like to call you Dave.
Sure, not a problem.
So today we're going to be talking about supply and demand and the PPE shortage. And honestly, I'd say over the last 12 to 15 months, because it even predates the pandemic, a lot of supplies and supply chain in healthcare have been impacted pretty strongly. First, it was recalls, and then it was an unprecedented increase in demand. And so we're going to dive into that today. And Barbara, I wanted to welcome you to the episode as well. I know this is not your first time being on the show, whether it be one of the Beyond Clean podcasts or a vendor spotlight. So thanks for coming back.
Thanks, Justin. Thanks for having me.
All right, so why don't we start with just an overview, because that acronym PPE gets thrown out a lot, and it means a lot of different things. So can you tell us what PPE is? I know many people understand it already, but just an overview.
Justin, PPE is the acronym for personal protective equipment. This is equipment that is worn to minimize exposure to hazards that can cause serious workplace injuries and illnesses. These injuries and illnesses may result from contact with chemical, radiological, physical, electrical, mechanical, or other workplace hazards. PPE may include items such as safety goggles, gloves, shoes, safety glasses, earplugs, gowns, etc. While having PPE is important, there should also be a risk assessment on identifying the hazards that are present within the workplace. The selection, maintenance, and use of PPE, the training of the employees, and then monitoring the effectiveness to ensure a successful risk program.
Excellent. And then recently, and I mentioned it as we started the interview, but there's a shortage of PPE or personal protective equipment. Can we talk a little bit about how that's impacted hospitals?
Well, I think the major point is that, and we have found this through the pandemic, is that anytime that there's a disruption in the supply chain that already has its inherent flaws, and then you add on the burden of requiring contact with patients for individuals to not only care for patients, but also to give the vaccines where they need to garb up, if you will, you're going to have an issue where you're going to have a redistribution of those materials. The problem is that would be fine in a perfect world. But with the pandemic, we also had decreasing surgical volumes as elective surgery were either postponed, delayed, or canceled. And so with a declining need in the central supply areas, central processing areas, and the operating room, there was a redistribution of those materials. And now that the United States is opening back up again with increasing case volumes, you have the surgical areas that are gathering steam, but unfortunately they're finding if they were based on using wrap for their wrapping of their instrument trays, that the materials are just not there. Therefore, a shortage.
Yeah, Barbara's absolutely right. If we look back during the pandemic, we look at the face masks, the N95 issues, we didn't have enough for healthcare, let alone the rest of the general public being told to wear masks. If we skip over to the blue wrap material, blue sterilization wrap, the core product is polypropylene. So I believe, as I was told years ago, the base product for that polypropylene are these little tiny pellets that they use, and that base product can be used to make a number of products. So as Barbara indicated, as we needed more masks and more other materials, they shifted all that root product over to developing that type of PPE.
You know, this is a pretty in-depth background type of conversation, not the things that people hear about on the front lines on a regular basis, right? The material composition of the products that are coming through. I think some people are well aware of it, but I can see how it would be really confusing. And there's probably a lot of misconceptions around this supply shortage and the increasing demand. What do you think needs to be clarified for people that are on the front lines?
Well, I think some of the misconceptions are that overnight, maybe we can just switch to a rigid container system, or overnight or within the next week, we can maybe switch back to what we'll refer to as muslin wrappers, or as Amy refers to it, surgical textiles. That's the old reusable wraps that we used to use prior to the disposables. By the time you're probably really truly done setting that up, that could take probably upwards to probably a month or so of time to either switch to a rigid container system or to switch to those muslin wrappers that we used to use.
Boy, muslin, there's a term I haven't heard in a while.
Sure.
So what's the true cause of this situation and this shortage? In your minds, what's the root cause here?
Well, the root cause for me is dependability. When you go with a one-trick pony and you don't look at other alternatives, when something disrupts that portion of the supply system that you've been so dependent on, and as Dave just alluded to, there are many in our industry that just think you can, I dream a genie and pop your hands on your two forearms and something will appear. And it takes a lot more for there to be this development of where am I getting the goods from and how am I getting them? And then how am I in fact storing them? And then how am I getting rid of them or disposing of them? And so the true cause is that rigid containers have been out there for an eternity now. And yet we still have a society that many facilities are dependent on blue wrap. And just as we all know that we've gone through and there's been back orders, let's say in custom packs, that once that happens, wow, it really hits you and you really do have to scamper. So this is huge to many facilities in our country.
So I've always heard people say regarding their investments to diversify their portfolio, meaning don't put all your eggs in one basket. And I think the word basket is kind of apropos here. So is what you're saying, Barbara Ann, that there's really just not more than one option, that there's no backup plan, and that puts people in a precarious position when demand is high and supply is low and not meeting the need?
Absolutely, Justin. And unfortunately, we still live in a world where I've always done it that way still exists. And so people that have always used wrap, and I'm not condemning wrap, there's a place for wrap, but people that have always used wrap but have never considered another alternative for many justifiable reasons, but just has not done that, has placed them in the awkward position of not being able to turn out instrumentation now for surgeries that are booming, quite frankly.
Yeah, and with the loss of revenues earlier in the year, they're booming because they have a lot of ground to make up, not just in revenue, but also in the fact that there were lots of people who were waiting to have these procedures.
Absolutely.
And so there's a backlog in the supply and demand just to meet the needs of all the patients out there that were waiting for these procedures. So there's something else that you just said, Barbara Ann, about disposing of materials. Do you want to talk about that a little bit more?
So a few years back, the United States Environmental Protection Agency worked with the Mayo Clinic based out of the University of Minnesota. And I found that to be very interesting because what they did was what's called, and we love acronyms, an LCA, a life cycle assessment. And that is a tool that's used to quantify environmental impacts for products, systems, and or services throughout their entire life cycle. And the conclusions that came from that, I should tell you the basis of what the study was. There was sterilization protection for 100 surgical trays used 365 times over a 10-year period. And that's the way they extrapolated it. And basically the conclusions of that, without going into 15 pages, the conclusion of that was that if you used a rigid container system, that you only had half of the green light gas emissions than if you had wrap. And the conclusions that they came with was you don't throw a rigid container away every time you use it, but you do that with single-use wrap of whatever color, blue, white, pink, but you do that. And in doing so, you have to look at the costs not only associated with purchasing it, but when you do a total cost analysis, you're looking at what is it going to take for me to purchase it? How much do I need to purchase? Where do I need to store it? Because storage is extremely important when it comes to all the various sizes and dimensions that you need to come up with in order to have an adequate inventory of wrap. And then, of course, the disposal. And the disposal is incredible because some people said, well, I can get it recycled. Well, most people don't realize that recycling isn't free. You pay for recycling. So there's a cost even besides either disposing of it with your waste or recycling it, you're still paying to offload it. And so there's this total costing out that many people have never learned how to do and certainly then don't do it.
So just transitioning to rigid containers, I'm hearing some of the benefits and advantages in that conversation, Barbara Ann. But Dave, you mentioned earlier, you can't just snap your fingers and make the switch overnight, right? So
Correct.
Let's talk more about those advantages. I'd like to hear you kind of leap off of what Barbara Ann just said and talk about some ways to be maybe successful in addressing this challenge with the other available options on the market.
Sure. I mean, with any rigid container system, I think first and foremost, you want to go to our guidance documents, and our primary guidance document is the AAMI ST79 2017 document. And there's a very good annex in the back of that book, Annex H, as in Harry. It's called the Development of a Pre-Purchase Evaluation Protocol for Rigid Sterilization Container Systems. And that document will help users. It'll guide you through all of the considerations you have to take, some of them which Barbara just mentioned, but all of these considerations that you have to take into account when you're looking at selecting, because there's multiple brands out there on the market, selecting the brand and trying to match the need to the product. So it's important to know, earlier I mentioned the reusable textiles. Again, we have more guidance for that product as well. The AAMI ST65 document is a document that covers the entire reprocessing of reusable textiles. I want to remind users out there that you're all familiar with what we call EUAs, the emergency use authorizations that the FDA issued back during the pandemic. They issued those, and that's what allowed us to reprocess the N95 masks. Those EUAs have not been issued. We know that this is a problem. The blue wrap is causing some pain, but there's been no EUAs authorized. There's been no shortcuts given to us where we can implement these strategies and ignore the current standards and guidelines.
So what would you say are the best practices for transitioning to rigid containers? Knowing what you just said, and knowing that this shortage is probably going to last for quite some time, I would think people would need to get ahead of the game on this because, like you said, it's not going to happen overnight. So what are some of the best practices and considerations for a transition, or at least the introduction of the product?
So the first thing that I would suggest is that the individuals responsible for setting off the change get a multidisciplinary group within the organization to do their due diligence. There's homework that has to be done. And so that homework, the first part of it with the group that's assembled, there should be a basic understanding as to what they know and what they don't know. Because sometimes it's what you don't know that's much more important than what you know. And then the third facet of that, I think, which is what many people today do not do, and it absolutely blows my mind, but contact the manufacturers that you're considering and get the facts. In getting the facts, it's going to save you time of developing questions and a questioning cycle that you would go through that you wouldn't need to do if you would talk to the people that actually manufacture the product itself. I'm a big proponent of you can read as many blogs as you want, but the blogs, you have no idea who's answering them and what their purposes or naivety might be. They might think they have the right information, but the right information really comes directly from the manufacturer or the producer of the product. So Dave, why don't you add to that?
Absolutely. When that team is put together, one of the first things I would recommend is that they do a pro and a con. I mean, every product has a pro and a con. We just spoke about the blue wrap or the sterilization wrap. The Healthcare Plastics Recycling Council put out a report that said there's 255 million pounds of blue wrap discarded by healthcare each year. So there's pluses with blue wrap because, for instance, you don't have to reprocess it. You might not look at it as a negative, but one of the things with the container system is we have to make sure that that container system is functioning properly. Do you have a cart washer? Do you have the staff that can help recycle or turn over that rigid container system? So these are the things that you have to do when you approach anything. You always do a pro and a con and try to address those before the product comes in.
So, Dave, with the shortage in wrap, my feeling on this is that the bulk of the impact is really going to be on that vendor managed inventory, right? Loaner and consignment trays, because there are facilities that have rigid sterilization containers, but they're not necessarily using them for that vendor managed inventory. Do you see it the same way?
Absolutely. I mean, typically in a typical SPD department, that could be up to 40% of the volume that we push through. And to your point, those are typically the trays that are in a blue wrap. So there really isn't one answer to this equation. If you're already a facility, and most of us already have rigid container systems on the shelf, the answer may not necessarily be going to the same exact container that you're using for the loaners, because there are different technologies. Not all of the containers are built the same way on the market today.
So, Barbara Ann, from your perspective, what makes the one tray such a perfect solution for the challenges that are really facing sterile processing departments today?
There are no magic boxes out there in the marketplace, and one tray is not one either. We all undergo the same FDA testing requirements. But Justin, I'd like to discuss two distinct differences with a one tray. One tray has been cleared with a 48-hour storage. Remember, storage is storage. One tray has the fastest reprocessing time because there is no requirement for a dry time. Users should follow the medical device's exposure time and temperature, but eliminate the dry time when using a one tray, as the dry time comes from the sterile barrier system or packaging system. The second point is equally as important. Just a few years ago, a wrap manufacturer did a study on rigid containers, and by the way, one tray was not included, to prove that, of course, rigid containers over time will lose their ability to function according to the original equipment manufacturer's specifications. The owner of one tray understood this important fact, and for that reason, he provides a lifetime warranty on every part of a one tray. When the rigid container starts to get beat up, the benefit sets one tray apart from all other rigid containers. You can return it to the manufacturer, and if it doesn't meet specifications, it'd be repaired or replaced at no cost to you. As a user, I found this to be huge. You are saving money by selecting this packaging system over the rest because you're not going to be paying for any repair costs. Wow, just think, a decrease in the expense portion of my budget.
Barbara, with that, I have an important question for you. I was a beta user of the one tray when it first came into the market, and I've been out of the field and doing consulting right now for about 3 years. But when I was using the device, I do recall it was made in the USA. So my question for you is, are there one trays available in stock and the filter kits as well?
That's a great question, Dave. My understanding is that we have 1 million filter kits sitting on a shelf and sitting in containment ready for distribution. And yes, we also do have trays that are available because just like anyone else in the industry, sales certainly slowed down with surgeries being delayed or postponed or canceled for that matter. So we're ready. We're ready to address the needs of our operations.
That's excellent, Barbara Ann. I know everybody's looking for Made in the USA right now. You both did a phenomenal job on this interview. I want to thank you for coming on. Dave, first, a first-time appearance on the Beyond Clean podcast, so thank you.
Hopefully more in the future.
And Barbara Ann, you're a seasoned veteran on here. Thank you again for sharing your insights today.
Thanks, Justin.
That was Barbara Ann Harmer, Vice President of Clinical Services at IST OneTray, and Dave Jagrosse, President at David Jagrosse Consulting. And this was a very interesting conversation and very timely because of what's been going on in the world, as I said in the intro to the podcast. And I think one very important point that was made at the end of this interview was Made in the USA. I know that a lot of the strategies in strategic sourcing and supply chain has been to look at manufacturers and distributors that are either making the product in the U.S. or have local distribution, and really trying to make sure that you're able to meet that demand, not only now with increased demand, but in the future, and maybe redefining or re-engineering the process for that. So great job, Barbara Ann. Great job, Dave. Really appreciate your insights on today's Vendor Spotlight. And that's going to do it. As a reminder, you can help support us by subscribing to Beyond Clean on iTunes, Stitcher, Google Podcasts, and Spotify. We'd certainly appreciate a rating and a review because your feedback is important to the show. If you have any topics that you'd like us to cover on a future episode, just send an email to info@beyondclean.net. Thank you for listening to this Vendor Spotlight on Beyond Clean.